The Galactic Council chamber floated in orbit above a dying star, its light fading slowly like the last breath of a fading civilization, and the great hall was filled with a heavy silence that made every alien delegate uneasy as they stared at the holographic projection before them, showing Earth's fleet rising from the smoke of battle victorious against the Trilak Armada that once ruled the outer sectors of the galaxy, and no one spoke for several minutes as if afraid to break the weight of that image, and among them Ambassador Liran of the Vesh Dominion trembled slightly, his scaled fingers tightening around the edge of the metal table, while he tried to understand how a species that had been considered backward and isolated only a few decades ago had now crushed a force that even the Council feared to oppose. And he turned to the Council chair, a tall being of shimmering blue light known as Orlan, who remained still and silent, his many eyes reflecting the faint glimmer of the dying star outside the window. And Liran finally gathered the courage to speak, his voice dry and hesitant when he said they cannot be ignored anymore, and the words hung in the air like a curse because everyone in the chamber knew that the humans had changed the balance of power forever and far away on the edge of Earth's orbit. Commander Laura Briggs stood inside the control deck of Aegis 1, the great fortress that circled the planet like a silent guardian, and she watched the holographic reports with a calm face, though her heart still carried the echoes of battle and the names of those who had not returned from the fight, and the soft hum of the station filled the background as she moved between officers checking data lines and energy readings, while the large viewing window displayed Earth below, bright blue and alive and full of hope for the first time in generations. And she thought about how much the world had changed since the first alien ship had entered the solar system, and how humanity had nearly fallen before rising again with a fury that even they had not known they possessed. And she remembered when the first orbital bombardments struck the surface cities, when entire nations were wiped out, and how from the ashes came unity and determination that no one could have imagined. And now the humans had done what the Council never expected. They had retaliated with unmatched strength and strategy, and they had won. And as Laura listened to her officer's report on the state of the fleet, she felt the weight of command pressing heavily on her shoulders, because victory had come at a terrible cost, and peace was not guaranteed. And she looked toward the stars, knowing that the Council would not simply accept defeat. And across the solar system, communication lines were alive with coded messages, diplomats trying to reach the Council while military advisors debated how to secure Earth's place in the galaxy and on the surface of Mars. Lieutenant Karen Ross coordinated the rebuilding of damaged colonies, her voice firm, as she directed cargo drones and construction teams across the Red Plains, and she felt pride that for the first time, humans were united under one command, one goal and one banner, and that banner was survival and freedom. And she remembered the message Admiral Scott Pierce had sent to every colony after the victory, a short message that said, "We are free, but we must remain ready because they will return." And his words had become a vow repeated by soldiers, workers, and civilians alike across every outpost and ship. And even now in the Council chambers, those same words echoed in the minds of the alien delegates who feared what would come next. And in a hidden chamber beneath the Council's main hall, a smaller group of delegates met in secret, their voices hushed as they discussed what to do with the humans. Some wanted to open talks, others wanted to strike before humanity grew stronger, but none could agree because none truly understood what made Earth different. And one of them, an old scholar named Varen, said quietly that it is not their weapons we should fear. It is their will, because they fight, as if they have nothing left to lose. And the others fell silent, because deep down they knew he was right. And as the meeting ended, Liran returned to his quarters, staring out into the endless stars, wondering what kind of world would emerge from this chaos and whether the Council itself could survive what was coming. And back aboard Aegis 1, Laura received a new transmission from the fleet flagship Endeavour. Admiral Pierce's face appeared on the screen, lined with exhaustion, but steady with resolve. He said, "The Council is meeting again. They will demand answers and perhaps try to make threats, and we must be ready to show them that Earth will not bend again." And Laura nodded quietly, replying, "We are ready, sir." And after the call ended, she stood by the window, watching the slow dance of the Earth below and the stars beyond, and she thought about how fragile peace was and how easily it could shatter. And she whispered softly to herself that humanity had earned this moment, and no one would take it away. and in that silent vow she found strength for the battles yet to come. Admiral Scott Pierce stood inside the command room of the fleet flagship Endeavour, surrounded by the quiet hum of machines and the soft flicker of holographic displays that showed the positions of human ships spread across the solar system, and his tired eyes moved slowly from one data feed to another, while his thoughts were on the meeting that was about to happen with the Galactic Council, who had finally agreed to speak with Earth after weeks of silence that felt heavier than any battle. And around him his officers moved with quiet discipline, their voices low as they relayed updates from Mars and the lunar defense grids, and the mood across the entire fleet was cautious, because no one trusted the Council, and everyone knew that. The peace they were pretending to offer might only be a test to see how far humanity could be pushed, and Scott had seen enough in his years of command to understand that this was not over. Not by a long shot, and he rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the weight of every soul lost in the war and every promise made to the survivors, that Earth would never be under another's control again. And on Mars, Lieutenant Karen Ross was working long hours to keep the rebuilding process alive. She stood near the colony's main landing bay where new supplies from Earth arrived daily, and her uniform was stained with dust as she gave orders to engineers and pilots, her voice calm but firm because she knew that order was the only thing that kept people from losing hope. And when she looked at the workers hauling metal frames across the red plain, she thought about how many had lost families during the invasion. And yet they still worked without complaint, building homes for others because that was what humanity did when pushed to the edge. They built, they adapted, they endured. And as the sun set behind the Martian horizon, she paused for a moment to look at the growing lights of the colony below, feeling proud that even in this harsh place life continued, and far above the planet in orbit around Earth. Commander Laura Briggs sat in the briefing room of Aegis 1 with her senior officers reviewing the Council's transmission that had arrived earlier that day. It was filled with carefully chosen words about peace and unity, but Laura could read the hidden threat behind them because she had learned to listen between the lines of diplomacy, and she said quietly to her team, "They are afraid of us, but they will never admit it." And one of her officers, a young strategist named Ethan Cross, looked at her and asked, "What should we do if they come again?" And Laura replied, "We stay ready. We do not start a war, but we will finish it if they bring one." And the room fell silent for a moment before everyone nodded, because those words captured exactly what every human now felt. And later that night, when the lights dimmed across the fortress, Laura walked alone through the observation deck, watching the Earth below shining against the dark. And she thought about her family who had lived through the first invasion, and how everything she did now was for them, and for every life that had been lost to the arrogance of the Council. And she knew that the next few days would decide whether there would be lasting peace or another war. And in the grand chambers of the Council on the other side of the galaxy, Ambassador Liran stood once again before the assembly, facing delegates from dozens of species, each speaking in their strange languages about what should be done with Earth. Some called for sanctions, others for surveillance, and some for direct military intervention. But none could agree because deep down, they were still afraid of what humanity had proven itself capable of. And Liran tried to argue that humans were not monsters but survivors, that they only fought when attacked. But his words met resistance from those who had lost fleets to Earth's retaliation. And finally, Orlan, the council chair, raised his hand and the chamber fell silent, and he said, "We will send envoys to Earth to test their intentions, and if they refuse cooperation, we will act accordingly." And though his tone was calm, Liran saw the flicker of fear behind his many eyes, because he knew that even Orlan was unsure if the Council could win another war against a united humanity. And when the session ended, Liran left quietly, feeling that something far greater was about to unfold. And back on Earth, Scott received the Council's message confirming that their delegation would arrive within 2 weeks, and he knew this was not a visit of peace, but a show of power. And he gathered his officers to prepare for every possibility, and his voice was calm but steady as he said, "We do not show fear, we do not show anger. We show them who we are and what we stand for," and those words spread across every base and ship until even the civilians began repeating them, because they carried strength and unity. And as the days passed, the fleet made silent preparations. Defense systems were tested, new satellites were launched, and communication relays extended beyond the moon. And through all of it, Laura and Scott worked side by side through secure channels, exchanging reports and thoughts late into the night. And one night Laura told Scott that maybe it was not about winning anymore. Maybe it was about proving that humanity could live without being ruled. And Scott agreed, saying that the moment they bow to fear, they lose what makes them human. And on Mars, Karen heard the same message broadcast to all colonies, and she smiled because for the first time in history, every human heart beat with the same purpose. And when the alien envoys finally departed from the Council Station heading toward Earth, the galaxy watched in silence, uncertain of what would happen next. And Liran, who had been chosen to lead the delegation, sat in his private quarters aboard the vessel, looking out into the cold void of space, thinking about the humans he had seen fight for their world, and wondering if this mission would bring peace or unleash something even greater. And as Earth grew larger in the viewport, he whispered a quiet hope that the Council would learn before it was too late that humanity was not to be conquered but to be respected, and far below in the command center of Aegis. 1. Laura watched the incoming signal of the alien ships approaching the solar system, and she gave a single order to her crew: keep shields active but weapons cold, because she knew that sometimes the greatest power lay not in striking first, but in waiting with unshakable resolve. And as the alien lights drew closer, the humans stood ready, calm and united under the vast silence of space. The alien ships entered the solar system under the flag of peace, but every sensor on Earth tracked their movement with silent precision as they glided past the outer planets toward the blue world that had become the center of galactic attention. And on Aegis 1, Commander Laura Briggs watched the feed with calm eyes, her hands resting on the edge of the console as her crew worked quietly around her, and she gave few orders because everything was already prepared. Shields active, communication ready, and no weapons charged yet. Every soldier knew how quickly that could change, and far away on the surface, Admiral Scott Pierce stood inside the Earth Defense Command Center beneath the mountains, where large screens filled the room, showing the alien convoy slowly approaching, and his voice was steady as he said, "Keep all systems online but hold fire unless they make a move." And though his face showed calm, his thoughts were full of memories of the war that had burned across the stars months earlier when the Trillic Armada fell, and how every victory had cost so much that he sometimes wondered if peace was only another form of battle. And across the Martian colonies, workers paused their labor to look up at the sky, knowing that the visitors from the stars were coming again, and many whispered quiet prayers, hoping this time it would not end in blood and in orbit. Above the moon, the defense stations glowed faintly in the darkness, their crews alert and ready for anything. And on the alien flagship, Ambassador Liran stood before the large viewing window, watching Earth grow larger with each passing minute, and though he had traveled across many worlds, none had stirred the same feeling in him as this one, because he knew what it had done to the galaxy and what it could still do. And his assistant, a younger Vesh officer, spoke nervously, asking if he believed the humans would truly welcome them. And Liran did not answer for a moment, then said, "They will not welcome us, but they will listen because they are not fools." And as the ship slowed into orbit above Earth, the Council's delegation sent their signal requesting permission to land, and Laura received it first, reading the calm words on her display before forwarding it to Admiral Pierce, who stood silent for a long time, then nodded and said, "Let them land on neutral ground near the Pacific base, and tell them they will be received under observation." And within the hour the alien ships descended through the atmosphere, their hulls gleaming in the sunlight like silver arrows, and crowds gathered at a safe distance watching as the great vessels touched down near the ocean, where the air shimmered from the heat of re-entry, and a team of soldiers and diplomats waved their uniforms marked with the blue emblem of the United Earth Defense Force, and among them stood Laura, who had arrived ahead of the landing to oversee security. She stood tall, her gaze fixed on the descending ships, and when the first ramp opened, she saw Liran step out surrounded by guards whose armor shimmered faintly under the light, and for a moment, both groups simply stared at one another, two species that had once fought across the stars now standing face to face, in silence broken only by the wind. And finally Laura stepped forward, her voice calm and clear when she said, "Welcome to Earth, Ambassador," and Liran inclined his head slightly, his voice low but steady when he replied, "We come in peace, Commander." Briggs, and though his tone was measured, she could hear the strain behind it, because even he did not believe entirely in his own words. And the two groups entered the nearby command dome where the talks were to begin, and as they walked through, The corridors Liran's eyes took in every detail of human technology, impressed and perhaps unsettled by how advanced it had become in so short a time. And when they reached the central chamber, Laura gestured for him to sit across the table from her, and the room grew quiet as translators prepared their systems, though both spoke enough of each other's language to understand without help. And Laura began by saying, "We appreciate that the Council has come to speak rather than fight, but make no mistake, Earth will not accept control from any power." And Liran met her eyes and replied, "The Council does not seek control, only understanding and cooperation." And Laura's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, when she said, "Then, let us see if your Council's idea of cooperation means equality or obedience." And the room remained still for a long moment, before Liran nodded slowly, saying, "Perhaps we both have much to learn." And far away in the depths of space, the Council's long-range ships listened in silence to the transmission, their commanders reporting back every word to Orlan, who sat in his high chamber reading the reports with a grim expression, because he could see that Earth would not be swayed by fear or promise, and that frightened him more than any weapon. And on Mars, Karen Ross gathered her engineers after hearing the news of the landing and told them that whatever happened, they would continue building, because peace or war life had to move forward. And that was what humanity did best. And she looked out over the horizon, thinking of all the lives that had been lost and all that had been gained. And she whispered to herself that no council, no alien, no war would ever take that from them again. And as night fell over the Pacific base, the first round of talks ended with no agreement, but also no conflict, and both sides returned to their quarters uneasy, yet aware that something was changing. And Liran stood by the window of his room looking at the distant lights of human cities glittering across the surface of the planet, and he felt a strange respect for these beings, who refused to kneel even before the might of the stars. And in another part of the base, Laura watched the same sky, thinking about what he might be feeling, and for the first time she wondered if peace was possible after all. But she also knew that peace could never come from weakness, only from strength and unity. And as she closed her eyes for a moment, she remembered the faces of those lost in the war, and she whispered quietly that their sacrifice would not be forgotten. And above the world in orbit, the defense satellites continued their silent watch, each one a reminder that Earth had learned never to trust blindly again, and the galaxy waited breathless for what would come next as the fragile line between peace and war trembled in the vast quiet of space. The second day of the meeting began under the same heavy silence that had marked the first, as the alien envoys walked into the main chamber guarded by their silent escorts, while human soldiers stood at attention, their faces calm, but their eyes sharp, and every movement was measured, because both sides knew that one wrong word could turn this fragile peace into war again. And Commander Laura Briggs sat at the center of the table across from Ambassador Liran, whose scaled hands rested lightly on the surface as though even the metal beneath them might shift with tension. And between them hovered a holographic display showing the terms proposed by the Council that spoke of cooperation in trade and security, but also included hidden clauses that would give the Council oversight of human expansion into new systems. And Laura read them slowly, her jaw tightening as she realized what they were asking for, and she said in a quiet voice that carried through the chamber, "You wish to give us the illusion of freedom while still holding the chains." And Liran looked at her for a long moment, his eyes showing no clear emotion before he said, "It is not control. It is protection from chaos." And Laura replied without raising her voice, "We have learned that protection is often another word for power." And behind her, Admiral Scott Pierce watched the exchange through a secure feed from Earth, his expression unreadable as he listened to every word and sent short-coded messages to Laura's console telling her to stay calm but firm. And across the galaxy, the Council received updates from their envoys with growing unease. As Orlan read the reports, he felt the weight of something greater than politics settling on his shoulders, because if this meeting failed, it would not just be another war. It would be the end of the Council's authority and power that had lasted for centuries, and he whispered to himself that the humans were changing everything. And back on Earth at the Pacific base, the tension grew thicker with every hour outside the meeting hall. Crowds of soldiers, engineers, and civilians watched the news streams, showing brief glimpses of the alien delegation, and everyone held their breath wondering what would happen next. And among them, Karen Ross, who had come from Mars to assist with logistics, stood near the command post, her eyes on the large screens as she coordinated supplies and made sure every defense protocol was ready in case the talks went wrong, and she spoke quietly to her team, telling them that hope was good but readiness was better. And her calm voice helped steady the nerves of those around her, because they all trusted her and knew she had seen the worst of the war and survived. And inside the meeting hall, the debate continued for hours as Liran tried to persuade Laura to accept limited oversight from the council, arguing that it would ensure mutual peace. But Laura refused each point with quiet precision, explaining that Earth would accept partnership but never submission. And the alien envoys began to whisper among themselves, their composure cracking as they realized that these humans would not bend, not even before the combined might of the galaxy. And when the session finally ended, Liran stood and said in a voice that sounded almost weary that he would need to speak with the council before continuing the talks, and Laura nodded, saying calmly that Earth would be ready when they decided what they truly wanted. And as the aliens returned to their ships, the human defense systems tracked every movement not with hostility, but with calculated precision. And later that night, Laura stood on the balcony of the command dome, looking out over the dark ocean, the air cool and still as she thought about the strange mix of fear and admiration she had seen in Liran's eyes. And she wondered if he truly believed that peace was possible between them, or if he was simply trying to delay what the council already planned. And in orbit above the world, Aegis 1 stood like a silent guardian, its lights reflecting off the black surface of space. And inside, Admiral Pierce reviewed new intelligence reports showing unusual fleet movements near council borders, and he knew then that the council was preparing for something bigger than a negotiation. And he closed his eyes for a moment, thinking about the years he had spent fighting for survival, and how now, even in victory, there was no rest. And he sent a coded message to Laura saying, "The council is stalling. Keep them talking. We need time." And Laura read the message hours later when she returned to her quarters, her mind still full of the day's words, and she understood that Earth could not afford to trust anyone. Yet and far above the galaxy, the council chamber was once again filled with the sound of raised voices, as delegates argued over what to do about humanity, some shouting that they must strike before it was too late, while others urged restraint, fearing the backlash of another failed war. And Orlan sat in silence until the noise became unbearable, and then he rose, his voice cold, as he said, "We will not strike, not yet. We will send reinforcements to our borders, and we will let them think. We seek peace, but when they show weakness, we will take what must be taken." And his words sent a chill through the chamber, because even those who agreed with him knew that the humans were not likely to show weakness. And when the meeting ended, Liran stood alone in the empty hall, feeling a deep unease because he had seen something in the humans that the council still refused to understand. A unity born from loss, a strength forged from pain. And he knew that if war came again, it would not end. The same way, and back on Earth, Laura could not sleep. She stood by the window watching the stars and thinking of how many lives still depended on the fragile choices made in rooms filled with politics and pride. And she whispered softly that no matter what came next, humanity would stand its ground, because that was what they did. And as dawn rose over the Pacific base, painting the sky in gold, she turned to her reflection in the glass and said quietly to herself, "We will not break." And at that same moment, far above in the council's fleet yards, warships were being prepared under the guise of patrols, their hulls gleaming cold and silent against the void, and the galaxy itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the storm that everyone knew was coming, yet no one dared to speak aloud. The day the Galactic Council delegation departed Earth began with a sky of calm blue and quiet oceans that seemed unaware of the tension rising across the world as the alien ships lifted slowly from the Pacific base, their engines glowing faintly in the morning light, and Commander Laura Briggs stood on the platform watching them ascend, her expression unreadable, though her heart felt heavy with the weight of what she knew was coming. And beside her, Admiral Scott Pierce stood silent, his hands clasped behind his back as the wind tugged at his uniform, and for a long time, neither of them spoke, because there were no words left that could change what they had both seen in the eyes of the alien envoy when he left. And finally Scott said softly, "They are not leaving to bring peace." And Laura nodded, saying, "They are leaving to prepare." and both of them turned toward the command dome where reports from deep space already showed unusual movement along the Council's borders fleets, redeploying ships gathering at rally points and hidden transmissions cutting through space. And Laura felt anger rise within her, not because she feared them, but because she was tired of endless wars and the lies that always came before them, and she said quietly, "We gave them a chance," and Scott replied, "We always do. And that is what makes us different." And across the world the message spread through the defense networks to every base and colony that the Council had ended talks, and that all commands were to maintain readiness level 1, and though the words were calm, their meaning was clear. The galaxy was shifting again toward conflict, and on Mars, Karen Ross stood before the colony's central tower watching as the workers moved. Faster than ever to finish the new shield arrays, her face streaked with dust as she issued orders through her headset, and she spoke firmly, telling her crew that this time they would not wait to be attacked. They would be ready. And when one of the younger engineers asked her if she thought another war was coming, she said maybe, but if it does, we will make sure it is the last one, and far away aboard his ship, Ambassador Liran sat in his quarters surrounded by reports from the Council, Fleets, his hands trembling slightly as he read the orders being sent to various sectors. And he knew that Orlan had already decided that peace was no longer an option, and that fear would once again guide their choices. And he felt a deep sadness, because he had seen the humans not as monsters but as survivors, and he whispered quietly to himself that they will not forgive another betrayal. And back on Earth, Admiral Pierce convened a meeting of senior officers inside the Underground Command Center where holographic projections of every human fleet filled the room, their movements synchronized with perfect precision, and he spoke slowly, his voice calm as he explained that Earth would not strike first, but that if the Council made a move they would respond without hesitation. And he looked around the room, seeing the determination in every face, and he said, "We fight not for conquest, but for our right to exist, and we will never surrender that right." And his words were carried across every ship and colony, becoming a rallying cry for all who heard them. And in orbit above the planet, Aegis 1 hummed quietly, its massive defense grid fully charged, while smaller ships patrolled the edges of the system, their captains ready, but disciplined. And Laura walked through the long corridors of the fortress, checking every sector, and speaking briefly with the crew, offering a few words of encouragement, and she could see in their eyes a mix of fear and pride, the same mixture that had carried humanity through every battle since the beginning. And when she reached the observation deck, she paused to look at the stars, thinking how strange it was that so much beauty could hide so much danger. And she thought of all the lives that depended on her decisions, and she whispered to the quiet room that if the galaxy wanted to test Earth again, they would learn the same lesson twice. And in the deep void between stars, the Council fleet began to move their warships, cutting through the darkness like silent blades, and their commanders spoke in hushed tones about striking quickly before the humans could react. But even as they planned their first moves, Earth's intelligence network intercepted the transmissions, and within minutes Admiral Pierce had the data displayed before him. And he smiled slightly, not with joy but with grim understanding, because the Council still believed they could hide behind secrecy and deception. And he turned to Laura on the secure channel, saying, "We have their plan now, we end this on our terms," and she nodded, replying, "It is time to remind them who we are." And the order went out through coded channels across the human fleets, every ship, every base, every colony activating coordinated defense maneuvers that would turn the solar system into an impenetrable shield. And when the Council fleet finally emerged near Jupiter expecting surprise, they found themselves surrounded by human warships, their engines silent, their weapons locked, but not firing, and a single message was sent across the void from Admiral Pierce to every ship in the enemy armada. The message said simply, "Leave now or be destroyed." And for a long moment, no one moved, the silence stretching across the stars, and then slowly the Council fleet began to withdraw, realizing that they had underestimated Earth once again. And on the bridge of the lead ship, Liran stood watching the retreat, his heart filled with both relief and fear, because he knew that the Council would not forgive this humiliation, but he also knew that war now would destroy them all. And he whispered to himself that perhaps this time fear had saved them from extinction, and when the last ship vanished into hyperspace, the humans did not cheer. There was no celebration, only quiet satisfaction, because they had defended their world without firing a single shot, and aboard Aegis 1. Laura watched the radar screens clear and said softly to her crew, "Stand down, but stay alert, and in." The command center beneath Earth Admiral Pierce closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of everything they had endured, and he said quietly that maybe this was not victory, but survival. And that was enough. And on Mars, Karen stood under, the stars looking up at the faint glow of Earth across the sky, and she smiled because she knew that no matter what the galaxy tried, humanity would never again be the same. And far away in the council chamber, Orlin listened to the reports, his expression dark as he realized that the era of dominance was over, and that a new power now stood among the stars, unbroken and unafraid. And the galaxy itself seemed to fall silent, as if acknowledging the truth that had been proven beyond doubt, that Earth would stand its ground and no one would ever again speak of them as weak or primitive. And in that silence, the future of every world began to change.